My main concerns about the EU's future are essentially internal. Now, there is a possible bridge between the internal challenges and the external phenomena that I've just mentioned, and that basically has to do with what Danny Roderick has been describing over the last few years as his famous trilemma. How do we reconcile the three phenomena that basically dominate our societies in this new world, namely economic globalization, political democracy, and national sovereignty? How can we enjoy these three things simultaneously? Or are we condemned to choosing only two of them and abandoning the other by the wayside? And I would basically argue that the European Union remains the best possible answer to Danny Roderick's trilemma. The European Union remains the best possible instrument or sets of instruments and policies that we Europeans have been able to design over the years in order to answer this challenge. Now, admittedly, and therefore I would argue that basically the European Union's future in the 21st century will essentially depend on its ability to, on the one hand, maximize the potential benefits of globalization and at the same time minimize the possible unwanted negative consequences of globalization. I basically see this as the EU's major threat, or major challenge, rather, in the 21st century. Now, as has been mentioned by in the two previous remarks, what we have seen in the last few years in Europe is that when citizens observe that our national authorities, that our national governments are basically impotent in coming to terms with global threats, they turn their backs both on globalization per se, but also, and perhaps even more worryingly, on representative democracy. And this is, I think, one of the things that we have been observing in the last couple of years. And very often, this frustration has been aimed at the European Union. And in my view, this is essentially unfair. And it's unfair for two reasons. First of all, because national governments are extremely good at playing the blame game. National governments nationalize success and Europeanize failure. We saw a very good example of this with one of Theresa May's tweets this week, by the way, in which she took credit for policies designed and implemented by the European Union trying to deal, in an attempt to deal with credit card fraud and misuse. At the same time, and this is also deeply ironic and a little bit hypocritical perhaps, very often the European Union is criticized for not doing enough precisely by those who have prevented the European Union from acquiring the competences that it would need in order to be effective in certain policy areas. This is also a very common sort of critique that we've seen over the years. Now, whatever the reasons, what we are seeing in Europe is essentially, I think, a growing cleavage between nativists and cosmopolitans. This has been brilliantly exploited by our populists, whether of the left or of the right. And of course, we all know that populists are very good at providing simple answers to complex problems. And the main problem with populists, of course, is that they are popular. And one thing that I would strongly encourage you to do is not to demonize our voters who have been seduced by populist political options, because ultimately, surely, our goal should be to bring them back into the fold. By the way, this has also led in some countries to very dramatic generational cleavages. So what should our priorities be then? First of all, I think the EU needs to demonstrate that it's part of the solution and not part of the problem. There is no doubt in my mind that that is the case, but specifically, it has to live up to its 21st century potential. And specifically, I think we can refer to 4 or 5 goals. First of all, the EU needs to secure the viability, the long-term viability and stability of the euro. If not, everything else will be in jeopardy. And by the way, after Brexit, the Eurozone will represent 85% of the European economy, considerably more than it does now. Secondly, the EU has to be more proactive in achieving sustainable inclusive growth and job creation, and most specifically, it has to be more proactive in helping national governments fight growing inequality in Europe, which I regard as one of the major social challenges currently facing the continent. Thirdly, I think we need to develop a credible migration policy. This, of course, is extremely difficult because it's a highly politicized issue, but we need a viable long-term migration strategy, and this, of course, means that we also need to rethink what kind of labor markets we want, etc. Fortress Europe is not the solution. In order for walls to be effective, you need to have doors and windows as well, and this is something that we have not yet been able to design. And fourthly, I would argue that we have to deal with aging populations, one of the issues that was mentioned earlier. Now, does all of this sound like a recipe for more Europe? Probably so, but not for ideological reasons. It's basically out of pragmatism and realism that I think we need to be able to expect more from the EU. We need more ambitious tools and more ambitious policies to face these new challenges. We probably need to reform our budget. It's absurd that a third of our budget is still dedicated to the common agricultural policy. Surely we can think of more interesting and dynamic and creative things to do with our money. Now, one problem, of course, with all of this is, do all 27 member states share the same appetite for reform, for proactive change within the EU? Possibly not. But let us not forget that our motto, the EU's motto, is unity in diversity, and therefore we have to respect the fact that some member states may not be fully engaged in this kind of activist program. Brexit, which I regard as a disaster for Britain and bad news for the EU, will nevertheless perhaps facilitate this. And in fact, to some extent, the combination of Trump and Brexit, by the way, interestingly, has already diminished Euroscepticism. We have seen an increase in the popularity of the European project since Trump and the Brexit referendum. So finally, I'm sure we'll have an opportunity in subsequent rounds to talk about more of those external issues that I mentioned initially. But my main concluding point would be, if the EU still aspires to be a force for good in the world, as it necessarily must, it needs to be able to guarantee its political and economic and social cohesion first.